Hello, and welcome to this webinar titled Single-Use Manufacturing within the Bristol-Myers Squibb Manufacturing Network, Preparing for Commercial Production, hosted by Biopharma Asia Magazine and presented by Lance Marquardt, Associate Director of Upstream Processing for Hopewell Clinical Manufacturing at Bristol-Myers Squibb, and Sara, Senior Marketing Manager for Merck's Single-Use Product Portfolio. My name is Stephen Edwards, and I'll be your moderator. Now, please allow me to introduce our first presenter. Lance Marquardt is the Associate Director of Upstream Processing for Hopewell Clinical Manufacturing at Bristol-Myers Squibb, bringing over 20 years of experience in the production of therapeutic proteins for clinical trials. Lance was a key member of the team that designed, built, and commissioned the first fully single-use facility within the BMS Manufacturing Network, and has since managed the facility producing early-phase clinical material for numerous BMS projects. Prior to this facility, he had experience utilizing hybrid single-use systems. He received his BS degree in biotechnology from the University of Wisconsin, River Falls, and his MS degree in Kean University. I'll now be handing over to our first presenter. Welcome, Lance.
Thank you, Stephen. As he said, my name is Lance Marquardt. I am the Associate Director of Upstream Processing for Hopewell Clinical Manufacturing within the Global Manufacturing and Supply Division of Bristol-Myers Squibb. I will be going over the current use of single-use within the BMS Manufacturing Network, as well as the steps we're taking to prepare for commercial manufacturing in a predominantly single-use facility. So I'll give you an overview of our internal manufacturing network, go over the current use of single-use components, talk about concerns as we approach commercial production using a predominantly single-use facility, and then go over results of an internal BMS survey. So the BMS Internal Manufacturing Network consists of 5 plants at 4 sites. 4 of our plants are located in the northeast of the United States, with 2 plants being co-located at the Devens, Massachusetts site, our early phase clinical site here in Hopewell, New Jersey, as well as our Syracuse, New York site. We also have a manufacturing site that was built last year and is currently being commissioned in Cruiserath in Ireland. Here's just a high-level overview of the BMS Manufacturing Network, and in the next slides, I will go over each of these manufacturing plants in a little bit more detail. And I will note the amount of single-use operations within each plant. So starting off here in Hopewell, New Jersey with our early phase clinical manufacturing site, our capacity, and I will be giving capacity in terms of the production bioreactors, are 4 by 1,000 liter single-use bioreactor trains. Single-use was introduced with the construction of this single-use site in 2013, and over 90% of the operations are done in single-use, either using single-use components or single-use designed equipment. Just to note that this site is being divested from the BMS Internal Manufacturing Network in 2020. Our Devens, Massachusetts clinical manufacturing site consists of 2 suites, each with 3 by 2,000 liter single-use bioreactor trains. It was a new construction in 2016, and the second suite was commissioned last year and is entering production starting this year. Once again, this is a predominantly single-use facility with over 90% of the operations occurring in with single-use. Our Syracuse, New York site is a commercial manufacturing site consisting of 7 by 5,000 liter stainless steel bioreactor trains. While it is a predominantly traditional stainless steel production facility, there are some single-use components and processing steps. Devens, Massachusetts, co-located with the clinical, is a commercial manufacturing site with 6 by 25,000 liter bioreactor trains. Once again, there is some minor use of single-use, but this is our main large-scale production facility that's currently operational. And then the Cruiserath, Ireland site that was built last year and is currently being commissioned will have 6 by 15,000 liter stainless steel bioreactor trains, and you'll note that there's an increased use of single use in this site, which in the next slides I'll explain further. So just an overview of the current BMS commercial biologics products with Orencia Nulogix, Yervoy, Opdivo, and Implicity. You can see that they're available in a variety of formats, and you can check the BMS website for the approved usages if you're interested. So where are single-use components currently used within the network? So anywhere where there's green on these next two slides indicates an area that is predominantly single-use within the given facility. And just once again on the side, the 5 different facilities are the Hopewell site here, the Devon single-use site, the Syracuse site, the Devon's large-scale manufacturing site, and the Kruzereth site. You can see that all sites have, for media prep and storage, capability of using single-use components. However, the commercial sites above a given volume will go to using their traditional stainless steel tanks. For expansion, this is vial thaw and the flask stage through a rocking bioreactor stage. All sites are single use. Whereas once you get into the scale-up reactors, before the N-1, there is some single-use components in each site, with the Kruzereth site actually using up to 2,000-liter single-use bioreactors in their site, but then the N-1 in production reactors are traditional stainless steel in all 3 commercial manufacturing locations. The harvest operations can be done using single-use depth filtration, and the larger sites integrating centrifuge and traditional depth filtration for their harvest clarification operations. Moving into the downstream. So once again, the green is an area where it is primarily a single-use operation. You can see that all sites, once again, buffer, prep, and storage have single-use capability, where once again, the commercial sites above a certain volume will go to using their traditional stainless steel tanks. For columns where it has the tan color, that indicates that we have evaluated the use of single-use pre-packed columns, however, that we're using them in a campaign basis and not truly single-using the components using a standard resin SIP in between each processing batch, but resins are dedicated for the particular product for the multi-product facilities. For the flow paths, the same thing, where we will use a single-use designed flow path. However, we will just CIP it and use it on a campaign basis. And the same thing for the TFF steps, where the TFF membranes may be designed for single use, but we will use them for a campaign basis. You will note that all sites currently use single-use components for their drug substance storage for shipment to the drug product manufacturing site, either in the freezable bag that's shown below or in larger bags designed for storage at 2 to 8. So some of the concerns as we approach increased use of single-use components for commercial manufacturing, the first concern was, is it robust enough? Oops. So based on our experience in clinical production, we feel yes, the single-use components are robust enough to meet the needs of clinical production. However, you do need to keep in mind the increased logistics and handling of single-use components. We found that it is very important to, where possible, to keep them in their original containers as they are supplied from the vendor, and then when you move them onto the production floor, to make sure that you have the space for storage of these components without compressing them, so that you do not introduce any additional stress on the components, which could lead to leaks. Once again, you need to keep in mind that there's going to be an increased logistical need for the handling of these increased consumables. Here at the Hopewell site, we ended up tripling our warehouse space when we transitioned to a primarily single-use manufacturing facility. Also need to keep in mind that the waste, those bags need to be removed from the suite and handled, and certain regions have additional requirements for how you handle them. For example, here in New Jersey, the upstream single-use bag waste has to be considered regulated Class 0 medical waste and has to be disposed of separately from a regular trash stream. The other concern was, is it the right scale? So you have to think about what can you do to increase throughput through your facility. So one thing you can do is process intensification. And now this can take many forms, such as introducing a continuous upstream or downstream perfusion process, introducing next generation processes for higher productivity through your facility, or increasing your cadence. One thing to keep in mind is, where possible, to have a really good process model of all steps, so that as you consider these process intensification steps, you can ensure that there are no new bottlenecks that are forming as a result of your process intensification work. The process model can also help you determine the need for increased staffing if you're going to decrease your cadence going forward, to make sure that all work can be done in the required amount of time. And then once the facility is up and running, keep in mind that the operators who actually run the facility will have ideas for continual improvement through your facility, and it's very important to keep them engaged to make sure that what they're seeing as they handle these things on the floor are built back into the model, and any improvements that they suggest are evaluated to see if they can be implemented. So once again, on the right scale, what is the productivity of your facility? So now this is going to depend on a couple of different things. Obviously, your cadence and your upstream titer and your downstream yield. Modeled here is an example facility, 3 by 2,000 liter upstream reactors with a 70% overall downstream recovery. Running at 30 batches per year, could produce up to 210 kilograms of drug substance per year, and obviously double that. But even at a low titer case, by going to 60 batches per year, you could get 170 kilograms out of this example facility. So what is your product demand? Shown here is a generic product demand curve of a molecule starting in year 1 with a phase 1 clinical trial, getting approval in year 6, and then as the early commercial uptake of this product increases, you can see the increasing demand. So if you just had this one example molecule and it was the only thing that your facility was supporting, you could see that a 3 by 2,000 liter facility could easily support the production demands of this one product. So here's just an example of a process model of our facility here in Hopewell that we did, where our base case was using a 14-day cadence, so harvesting a reactor every 2 weeks, taking 1 week for product changeover with no concurrent manufacturing, 10 products per year, and we were able to output 70 kilograms of drug substance from this facility. The process model was, we went to a 10, 11-day cadence, so harvesting 2 reactors every 3 weeks, with a 1-day changeover enabled by the single use, and we were able to increase our number of products through this facility per year to 14 products and have an increase in productivity of this facility to 110 kilograms for 160% increase throughput from this facility. We did have to increase staffing slightly by about 20% to accommodate this increased cadence. So what are the other priorities within your company? Shown here is a part of the BMS Biologics early phase network with the different products. And these are products that the clinical sites have been supporting and are looking to be moved towards commercial production in the near future. as well as keep in mind that the other plants in the commercial plants in the network are supporting the 5 established products. So BMS has a relationship with CMOs across the world to help us with our current commercial production needs, as well as planning for the future. And as these new molecules move online, move into commercial production, the BMS planning group, which is a whole separate group in amongst itself, is constantly evaluating what needs to be outsourced and what our internal plants can support. So from a CMC regulatory view, I asked our CMC folks what their main concern would be if we move to commercial production in a predominantly single-use facility. Their opinion was, since the facility needs to pass a pre-approval inspection to be licensed for the molecule, the fact that it uses more single-use components is not that relevant to the overall approval process. However, there is, a need for extractable leachable studies may be increased. As noted, most of our commercial processes already have the drug substance stored in a single-use container, and then some of our drug products you may have noticed are also in a single-use medical device. So these 2 areas already increase the need for extractable leachable studies. And then following BPOG guidance, we performed risk assessments on our current processes. And the further upstream you are from the drug product, the less risk there is. However, with chemical compatibility and what you're storing in the given bags, that still needs to be evaluated, and where your risk assessment indicates additional extractable leachable studies should be implemented. For early phase clinical, we usually just use the vendor extractable leachables and nothing specific, and as we move closer to the end of a product life cycle, we'll do more product-specific extractable leachable studies. So now I'm going to go over some results of a BMS internal survey that I did, just presenting the results of that survey. So I asked, are we ahead of, in line, or behind the rest of the industry with regards to single use? For clinical production, we're pretty much in line, if not a little ahead of the industry. Since 2015, most of our clinical production has been done in predominantly single-use facilities. And then for commercial production, we're either in line or behind the industry, as none of our commercial processes currently are licensed out of a predominantly single-use facility. So what were the drivers for single use? And these are the 3 things that have come across in both industry presentations and from the survey. The turnaround time, the decreased need for cleaning, the decreased need for validation, and reduced capital costs of these facilities makes them attractive going forward. The concerns for single use, things that we touched on already in this presentation, was that the process scale wasn't large enough. And as shown, as the processes increase, there are things that you can do to make sure that your single-use facility can output the proper amount of product. That it's not robust enough, once again, that's more of a handling issue. And that there's complexity for post-market changes, moving from a predominantly single-use to a traditional larger scale commercial facility. And once again, that change would need to be approved by the regulatory agencies and would usually be accompanied by a process change. So the change from a single-use to traditional should not be that much of an additional burden on post-market changes. So then I asked, do you think the challenges of doing commercial production in single-use is more challenging than past challenges in the industry, such as the development of chemically defined medias? Most people thought that this was a less challenging change. Some of us thought it was equally challenging. Upon review of the answers I've got, I realized that this is not a direct comparison. Those 2 changes are different in nature. As someone once told me, it's a chalk to cheese comparison, where the media development is more of a technical, scientific change, versus the operational changes needed to run in a single-use facility. The same concerns will govern the adoption of these technologies. However, single-use facilities will lend themselves easier to future improvements, such as process intensification and the move towards continuous processing, as it is easier to redesign a single-use assembly to accommodate these processes than it is to revalidate and repipe a hard-piped traditional facility. Keep in mind that the science and economics of the product will drive the implementation of these processes, and new BMS facilities are being designed with the ability to accommodate these improvements in the future. So what is the next big challenge within BMS as we move through to getting processes in more single use? It would be doing continuous downstream processing to improve the downstream throughput. BMS development scientists have shown that with 25% of the resin costs or the resin volume and using a continuous downstream process, you're able to support the same existing upstream processes but used just 25% of the amount of resin. However, using the same amount of resin, you'd be able to double the downstream throughput. The second thing people said is increasing the upstream throughput, either through next generation processes, increasing titer, or looking at continuous processing applications in the upstream. Keep in mind that these two things are going to feed on each other, with the overall trend of these improvements being more production in the existing BMS facilities. I'd just like to acknowledge a couple of people within the BMS network: Norm Stoffergen, my boss, John Cazzoli, Dave Wilson, Ryan Stielick from our commercial sites, the BMS survey responders, and Alyssa and Parrish from GE for their help in preparing for this presentation. We'll now be handing it off to Sara.
Thank you for that, Lance. Once again, I'd just like to interject that our viewers, that there will be a live Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to send in your questions at any time during the webinar via the questions tab located directly below your webinar screen. And we'll go through these at the end of the presentation. Now I'd like to introduce our second speaker. Sara Bell is a Senior Marketing Manager for Merck's single-use product portfolio. She manages the development and deployment of the single-use marketing strategy, which is heavily focused on delivering high-quality products with reduced lead times and an enhanced level of supply security. She previously led the single-use technology management team at Merck, supporting the successful launch of 5 new products to address end users' biggest problems, challenges, and unmet needs in single-use processing. Sara has over 14 years of experience in the biopharmaceutical industry. Prior to joining Merck in 2015, Sara spent 11 years working at Amgen, Rhode Island, where she held positions in process development, upstream manufacturing, product management, and quality control. She holds a BS in chemical engineering from the University of Rhode Island. I will now be handing over to our second presenter. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you, Stephen, for that introduction, and thank you, Lance, for the great presentation. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about a novel approach to single-use design, qualification, delivery, and implementation. We'll also talk about some of the challenges facing end users today. Some of them Lance already touched upon, and how we can overcome those challenges and work towards a more efficient, cost-effective, and successful implementation of single-use technologies, whether we're talking about pilot plant, clinical manufacturing, or commercial manufacturing. So the life science business of Merck KGaA Darmstadt, Germany operates as Millipore Sigma in the US and Canada. Outside of the US and Canada, we operate as Merck. And within the life science business, we aim to accelerate access to health for people everywhere. Within life science, we offer a full portfolio of products, solutions, and services to help research and the manufacturing of chemical and biological drugs. So for today's presentation, I'll touch briefly upon what's driving the increased adoption of single use and the benefits, many of which are well known and some of which Lance already touched upon. We're going to talk about some of the end users' biggest unmet needs when it comes to single-use technologies, what the state of the industry is today, what some of the challenges are that people are facing, and then how we can overcome those challenges. So if you look at some of the top trends right now within the biopharmaceutical manufacturing industry, and this data is coming directly from the 14th annual edition of the BioPlan Associates report, you can see there are a few things really driving the increased adoption of single use. One of them is a demand for production efficiency. So what we're seeing in the industry is that a lot of the large biopharma companies who traditionally were producing blockbuster drugs and single drugs out of large manufacturing facilities, they're really looking to diversify their portfolio and become multi-product facilities. We also see a rise in the amount of contract manufacturing organizations and how they are producing multi-products. And so because of that, people are looking for more efficiency in changing from one product to another and having minimizing risk of producing multiple drugs in one single facility. And single use is really appealing because it's self-contained and you don't need to do a lot of changeover activities moving from one product to another, especially when it comes to the cleaning associated with that and the validation that's needed to prove that there's no product carryover from one to the other. We also see a big boom in the emerging markets and a lot of growth in places like China, Japan, South Korea, India. And what we're seeing is there's a desire to do more in-country, for-country manufacturing. And so in those parts of the world, they're really looking to build facilities as fast as they can and as cost-effectively as they can. And again, single use becomes very appealing in those instances. We're also seeing the rise of biosimilars, some of which are coming from those emerging markets. And even big, large biopharma now is looking to move into the biosimilar market. But what this is doing is it's putting a lot of pressure on the originator manufacturers of these molecules, and it's causing them to really look at reducing their costs. And one way to do that is to start to look at single-use technologies. And then lastly, we're seeing a big rise in kind of novel therapies, things like cell and gene therapies. And what we see with these novel therapies is much smaller batch sizes. And again, single use is very appealing when you're looking at smaller batch sizes because of the flexibility, the efficiency, the self-containment, and the risk mitigation that it offers. So for all of these reasons, we're seeing a trend and an increase in single-use adoption. And if you shift to the right of the slide, you'll see some of these trends. So specifically looking at 2016 to 2017, within the clinical production, both upstream and downstream, we saw a 20 to a 25% increase in the adoption of single-use technologies. And then if you look at commercial manufacturing, same thing. So upstream and downstream, we're seeing anywhere from a 15 to a 20% increase from 2016 to 2017. And as many of those clinical molecules move through the pipeline and become commercialized, we'll again see that trend upwards of single-use technology. So I don't think there's any end in sight for the growth of single-use technologies. I think it will continue to grow. And so for that, we need to look at how to implement it most efficiently and effectively. So why people are implementing single use, I think these benefits are very widely known at this point, but really the top ones are increase in speed and reduced costs, especially when you're trying to bring new therapies to market or get new facilities up and running. And just to look at some of the benefits, the top benefit is really the elimination of cleaning requirements. And this, again, comes into play with multi-product facilities. You're able to use about 80% less water and energy with a single-use facility by not having to clean and sterilize systems between batches. Also, the time it takes to get a facility up and running can be cut in half. And now we're seeing with the advent of modular facilities, bringing new facilities online, single-use facilities, in anywhere from 12 to 15 months, from basically breaking ground all the way through to being able to produce something in that facility, which is quite astonishing. Also, the capital investment is significantly reduced. A single-use facility costs about 25% of what a traditional or conventional stainless steel facility would cost. And then throughput is increased because you're able to change over very quickly. So you're able to change over about 80% faster, which means more batches, higher throughput for that facility. And then there are also benefits when it comes to reduced risk and increased quality. Because single-use systems are self-contained by nature, you're minimizing the chance of contamination and cross-contamination, and so you're getting that increased quality there. And then in terms of flexibility, we're able to do all of these things in a much smaller footprint. So again, it speaks to the upfront investment being reduced, but also less resources and less footprint, especially when you're talking about these emerging markets, and it's harder to get land and resources and things like that. So lots of benefits associated with single use. So now we're going to move into some of the end user implementation needs. So in 2015, we partnered with a third party to do a pretty intensive survey to really drive down into what are the biggest unmet needs that end users have when it comes to single-use technologies. And what we found was that supply security and quality were among the top needs. And so when we talk about supply security, we're not only talking about lead times and getting things faster, but we're talking about the reliability of those lead times. So as a drug manufacturer, it's very important that you're receiving the parts when you expect them, because your production schedule and your plan is built around that. With traditional facilities, a lot of your schedule and planning was designed around equipment turnaround time and how long it would take to clean and steam systems before you could rebatch in them. So it was the end user driving that. Now we've shifted responsibility to the supplier, and so making sure that you have a supplier that you can trust and rely on is very important, and your supply security and your production plan really depend on it. The second piece is the quality and technical support related to the products you're receiving, and that entails extractables and leachables data, and Lance touched upon this a little bit. The product quality itself, but also the documentation that is supplied from the vendor to the end user to support those parts, those single-use parts. And that really enables a smooth and fast implementation, and also helps the end user support regulatory filings and regulatory inspections and approvals. And then lastly is cost. And this isn't saying that cost isn't a factor, it's just that typically supply security and quality come above the cost. And so if as a vendor you can provide security in those other areas, cost tends to not be as much of a concern. So we talked about the benefits, we talked about the needs. Now let's talk about some of the challenges or considerations that you need to think about when you're implementing single use. The biggest change moving from traditional stainless steel manufacturing to single use is that as an end user, you're transferring a lot of your critical control strategies to the supplier. So whereas before end users had complete control over their validation strategies, execution, data, and ownership of that data, that's now been shifted to the supplier with single use. So the supplier designs the assembly with the help of the customer, but they are really the one designing the validation strategies around integrity, sterility, packaging and shipping, all the release testing and things like that. So you want to make sure you build a strong partnership with your supplier and that you have insights into the supplier's quality systems, how they're doing this testing, how it's all documented, that you know that you have access to it when you need it to support your regulatory filings and your regulatory inspections. And then from an execution standpoint, as Lance touched upon in his presentation, operator handling. If you're used to doing traditional stainless steel manufacturing and you're moving towards single use, it is a major shift with operators in handling of those systems. And so making sure you're leveraging your supplier to provide training to your operators so that they aren't increasing the risk of having leaks or damage to those assemblies as part of the installation, warehousing, movement, and implementation of single use. So from a supplier perspective, I wanted to shed a little bit of light of the approach that is taken. So really from a supplier, we look at the risk associated with everything from raw material procurement through to the irradiation and shipping and transport of that assembly to the customer. So we take a risk-based approach and we look at risk along that entire life cycle and supply chain and design robust strategies and processes to mitigate those risks along the way. So when we're talking about raw materials and components, it's anytime we bring in a new component to our library or to our facility, we are qualifying that component. We're doing testing on that component to make sure it's safe for use as, when it gets to the end user, but also that it's safe to bring into our facility. So we're doing testing for bioburden. We're doing shelf life testing. We're doing functional testing of those components before we even bring them into our library. And also making sure that the cleanliness of the raw material manufacturing process is adequate so that when we bring it into our facility, it's not going to introduce particulates or, again, bioburden and impact anything else that we're making in the process. The second is the validation of the design itself. So this can get challenging when we talk about custom designs because you can't validate every single custom design. It's just not feasible with thousands of them. So what we do is take a family approach or a worst case approach and validate that way. And so we use reference assemblies for sterility testing, stability testing, and shipping testing. In terms of the manufacturing process itself, we're validating the connections, and then we're also validating all of the equipment and the process used to manufacture the assemblies. And then lastly, from a quality perspective, that we have methods in place, we have lot release criteria in place, and that we have a robust sterilization process that's validated before the assemblies are shipped to the customer. And then once the assembly is shipped to the customer, the ownership is on the customer to make sure that the process is validated with that part based on their user requirements and internal specifications and process parameters. So now we're going to look at kind of the state of the industry of single use today. So if we look at the current situation, we know that the benefits of single use are well known, and because of that, more and more people are adopting them. So we have a lot of people. When I say a lot of people, I mean a lot of people at your site or within your network that have the ability to design single-use systems or assemblies. And the number of components available on the market today increases every day. So lots of options available. And more suppliers are entering the marketplace every day because single use looks so attractive with its growth, it's driving more and more suppliers to the market. And lastly is there's a lack of regulatory guidelines at this point. So many of the regulatory guidelines that we are working within are really intended for medical devices or final packaging that we're kind of adopting for single-use technologies. And so some of the guidelines aren't clear, and we don't have a lot of experience. And so sometimes we interpret things differently than how they may be intended because there aren't clear guidelines. So what this has led to is very custom and complex situations. And what that means for end users is typically they're experiencing long lead times because they're using custom products. It means that in order to mitigate supply risks, that end users are typically holding very large quantities of safety stock to mitigate that risk and make sure they have material on hand to support their production plan if, in fact, there were to be a supply disruption. What's happening is with every new custom design, if there's a new component introduced, qualification becomes very costly and time-consuming because you're constantly requalifying new parts and new components and doing more extractables testing. And then the management of the number of the part numbers, because you continue to create new custom part numbers all the time, it gets very difficult to manage from a procurement standpoint, from a change notification standpoint, and from a warehousing standpoint. And so if we look at the future, if we continue in this manner, if we don't start to standardize, if we don't start to harmonize, then the burden of managing single-use parts in terms of procurement, supply chain, warehousing, and change notifications, that resource burden is really going to start to outweigh the benefits of single use. So what can we do about it? So if you're new to implementing single use, that's great. You want to kind of take this approach right from the very beginning. If in fact you're 5, 10, 15 years down the road already, there's still time, but I would say pause and kind of evaluate some of the things that I'm going to go through right now and see what you can do within your organization about it. So first and foremost is to create an organization with single-use expertise and oversight. And what I mean by that is have sort of a governing board or a specific group in your organization that is the gatekeeper for new single-use designs. So what this is going to do is provide some oversight so that when a new design is needed, you can evaluate all the existing designs that your site is using or your network is using and see if you already have something within your network that could fit that use or application so that you're not creating a new part number. So I think this is really important. And then secondly, you want to work within your site and network organization to develop an optimized design space. So what this means is basically just a preferred component list that you guys are using to design new assemblies. And this can be specific to your site, to your group, to your network. You just want to make sure you work cross-functionally so it fits everyone's needs. But how you would go about doing this is look at historical data and performance. What are the things that you're already using that you have success using and a good history using? What are your operators like using? What's going to work in manufacturing and not lead to mistakes or errors? What do you already have extractables data for so that you don't have to repeat any extractables data as you bring in or as you design new assemblies? Again, what documentation and qualification support do you have for those individual components? And then looking at your history and supply reliability with those vendors. Is it good? Is it bad? Would you want to continue working with them or rely on them in the future? The other thing you can do is kind of go back and look at all of your existing part numbers for opportunities to harmonize. So you may have 5 different part numbers at your site that you're using that are very similar in nature. And if you just increase the length of tubing, it could be used, one single assembly could be used for 5 different applications or unit operations in your process. So there's an opportunity to harmonize, and what that does is it reduces your part numbers, right? So it's going to help with management of that part in terms of procurement and supply chain. It also may reduce the number of change notifications you're experiencing if you are changing material of construction to align across a few different assemblies. And then it allows you to have more flexibility in your network. And then lastly is working with your suppliers to improve supply reliability. So leverage your supplier. Go to them and say, can you review all the existing part numbers I'm buying from you and tell me where there are similarities? Tell me where there are opportunities to harmonize. And once you do that and consolidate, then you can work with your supplier to, maybe move into stocking agreements or standing orders or see what can be done to improve your supply security and supply predictability. So now I'm going to move into some potential solutions for what we just talked about. So if you look at the historical approaches that suppliers have taken for single-use assemblies, it really doesn't completely fit the needs of the end user. So on the left-hand side, you can see the highly customized nature. And this is very common with single-use technologies because end users want something that fits their unique requirements and process. So it's great. The end user has complete flexibility to design exactly what they need. The challenge here is it's longer lead time. So typically how custom assemblies work is when the end user places an order, it gets to the vendor, the vendor looks at what they have in stock and sees if they have to order any parts, because they cannot maintain safety stock of over 2,000 different components. So what will happen is there may be components that aren't in stock that then they have to order. So then that lead time of that assembly is at the discretion of how long it takes to get that component in stock. And that's why lead times are typically longer for custom assemblies. If you look to the right, you see standards. So standards are nice because they're fast lead times. Typically, they are built and stocked on the shelf. The downfall for the end user is that they need to accommodate a standard that may not fit their process perfectly. So they may be sacrificing something to get that shorter lead time. But what we found is there's this kind of sweet spot in the middle that really there wasn't, that need wasn't being filled or accommodated. And so how can we balance the lead time with the design flexibility and predictability? And so what we did at Millipore Sigma, or Merck, is we looked at our full portfolio of single use and we segmented it into 3 different categories. And we call this the Mobius MyWay portfolio, meaning you can get it whichever way that you want. So what we like about this is it really supports a variety of needs. So it supports the end user needs in terms of faster, more reliable lead times, and still having the flexibility to design a fit-for-purpose assembly. But on the other side, from a supplier perspective, it helps us be more efficient with our operations and our planning and our procurement of raw materials. And it also helps set us up for scalable growth in the future so that we can grow with the growth of single use and not, so that that demand doesn't outpace our capacity. And so if you look within the Mobius MyWay portfolio, we have 3 different categories of assemblies. One is called Mobius stock. So these are going to be standard part numbers and also high volume custom assemblies. So if you have a custom assembly that you're purchasing in a high volume over a year's time, we can move into a stocking agreement and hold that assembly on our shelf and ship it to you in 24 hours. You also have something called Mobius Select. So this is that middle piece of the Venn diagram. These are going to be configured to order assemblies from an optimized component library, and these are going to be shipped in 6 weeks. And then lastly is Mobius Choice, which is traditional custom assembly as we know it today, so highly customized solutions. These are going to be things for very unique applications that need to be customized, things like final fill applications, which are really designed to fit filling machines specifically for a customer. And you're going to get a more traditional lead time for Mobius Choice, which is going to be between 12 and 14 weeks. But you can design from our expansive component library. So I wanted to provide a little bit of insight as to how we developed this configurable design space, which we call the Mobius Select Library. And we took a bottoms-up approach to do this. So we looked at the history of over 10 years of assemblies that we've designed and developed, and we said, okay, what are the most commonly used components? So we looked at true, usage rates, and then we also looked at how those different components are combined to make assemblies for different types of applications. And through that, we developed a preferred component library. Other requirements that we have for that preferred component library are making sure that those components can be used for automated manufacturing, because we want to drive towards more automation so that we can reduce variability and increase quality of our parts. And we also looked at the supplier relationship we have for those components. So we wanted to make sure we have a strong supply agreement in place and we have a strong relationship with those suppliers so that we can always depend upon the supply of those parts, so that we can always deliver to our customers with a more reliable lead time within that 6 weeks. And then we also want to make sure we maintain safety stock of those components. The other thing we wanted to do was reduce the amount or the number of different materials of construction of the components so that we can reduce the number of change notifications for customers. So those were all the considerations that went into developing the Mobius Select library in this optimized design space. So now I'm going to just talk through some of the benefits associated with configurable assemblies versus standard assemblies or custom assemblies. And so just to recap, standard is a pre-designed solution off the shelf. Custom is fully customized by the end user, and configurable is you're working within a preset design space, but still designing a custom assembly within that design space. So just so everyone's clear on the definitions. But what we find with configurable assemblies is you can significantly increase your quality and your speed just by designing within a predefined design space. So in terms of flexibility, you still have plenty of flexibility. Really an unlimited number of designs can be built with 400 or so pre-qualified components. In terms of the consumable management burden and cost, like we talked about earlier, what this is doing is it's going to drive standardization and harmonization of part numbers. It's going to give you some confines to work within and help you harmonize and standardize your part numbers. Like I said, it's also going to reduce change notifications because we're minimizing the different materials of construction and thereby reducing the number of change notifications you should see, and also reducing the need for extractables testing. So we are doing BPOG extractable testing for these components, and we'll provide that documentation. And this should prevent you from having to do extractables testing on the individual components, which should save you time and money when you're bringing in new parts. In terms of the quality aspect, we're pre-qualifying all of the components, and again, making sure that we can automate the manufacture of the assemblies and the build of the bags and that process so that we can increase the quality and decrease variability. In terms of supply transparency and security, again, quality and supply agreements in place. We're maintaining safety stock of all of the components in this library to ensure the lead time that we're providing, and then reducing the number of different materials of construction. And lastly is speed. So when you work within the Mobius Select library, you're going to get an assembly drawing within 24 hours. You'll get prototypes in 4 weeks or less. You're going to get your actual assembly in 6 weeks or less. And then we also will provide a full documentation package in terms of regulatory statements and BPOG extractables as part of our Improve program. So this is my last slide, and I really just wanted to end with this. So just looking at the comparison between configurable, standard, and custom assemblies, you can see that configurable assemblies give you the most benefits. As long as you can work with a 6-week lead time, you get a whole lot of benefits as it relates to quality, standardization, supply reliability with the configurable option versus the standard or the custom option. And I think that was my last slide. So I guess, Stephen, we can turn it over to you for questions.
Yes, that'd be perfect. So as we just mentioned, now we will begin the question and answer segment of the webinar. But once again, I'd like to remind the audience that you can still send your questions in via the questions tab located directly below your webinar screen. So now, our first question. What are some of the other considerations when considering process intensification other than the process modeling? Lance, would you like to take this?
Yes, so that would be just looking at the impacts within your facility that are outside of the process model. And by that meaning, if you were going to implement, say, a perfusion process, you'd have to make sure that you have the space and the warehouse space to keep that perfusion assembly stored. And that would be the main thing to keep in mind outside of the process model.
Thank you. Our next question. Does BMS foresee any challenges when moving a process from a single-use launch facility to a more traditional larger-scale facility? Lance, again for you.
Once again, when I talk to our CMC regulatory folks, because that is going to be a facility change and require approval to license that facility for the production of the molecule, As long as the molecule being produced is of the same quality, we do not foresee that being a major change, or a major issue, sorry.
Our next question is, what are the keys to successful single-use implementation for commercial manufacturing? Sara, would you like to take this?
Sure. So I think the keys are really making sure you have a strong partnership with your supplier and doing that very early on in the process, making sure that you're able to clearly define your user requirements, and then also working cross-functionally, so cross-functionally within your organization, but also in the supplier's organization, and making sure there's representation from quality, manufacturing sciences, validation, regulatory, so that everyone, all the stakeholders are involved and clear on what's required from the vendor and also what's needed for a successful implementation. And then lastly, as you move towards or closer to actual implementation, doing engineering testing and design reviews is really important. Setting up your facility, even if it's taping things off, but using prototypes of your designs and doing some water testing to make sure that everything is going to fit, to make sure tubing lengths are right, to make sure you have the appropriate connections, especially if you're using gendered sterile connectors or aseptic connectors. And doing water runs and walk downs is really going to set you up for success for implementation. And Lance, I forgot to mention it during my slides, but in the attachment and link section, everyone can find a link to the Mobius MyWay page, and on there is an interactive tool that's going to show you exactly what's in that library if you're interested in looking at it.
Perfect. Our next question is, what was the main change in operations when you switched to single-use processing? I believe this one is for Lance.
So the main change was just being able to do that changeover a lot quicker, and the reduction of product-to-product testing that we had to do that enabled that quicker turnaround time. We did end up, for one of our suites, actually installing the single-use reactors side by side with the stainless steel and then having a longer shutdown later to remove the stainless steel equipment to free up some room in there, but not all sites would have the luxury of doing that. And then just keeping the increase in warehouse space was one of the things that, as we went to more single-use processing, that really stuck out of every time we increased our warehouse space, we would increase our cadence and then try to figure out how much additional warehouse space we needed. We did end up going to third-party warehousing companies so that the vendors could ship to there, and then we can ship from there as needed.
Thank you. Our next question. How can end users work to harmonize and consolidate their single-use assembly designs? Sara?
Sure. So I touched upon this a little bit in the slides, but really you want to go back and look at all of your existing designs. And this can be a big undertaking because there are a lot of designs, especially if you're working across multiple suppliers. But it's worth the effort to do these workshops and get all the stakeholders in a room and review and see where you can harmonize or consolidate, because that's going to allow you to reduce the number of part numbers you're managing. And then working with your suppliers, they can also help by doing some of the initial analysis for you and providing recommendations of minor tweaks that you could make that wouldn't have a big impact or require huge, change management on your part. And that may set you up for future success in terms of supply security and supply reliability, and also driving towards more standardization within your network.
Thank you. Moving on, the next question is, how do vendors ensure supply security? I believe this one's for you as well, Sara.
Sure. So as a vendor, it's really looking at supply security very holistically. So vendor management on our part, making sure that we're looking at our supply chain and not just our critical suppliers, but all of the suppliers and their suppliers. So digging really deep into the supply chain and making sure we have visibility and control over that. Also, making sure that we are managing within our network, where we're manufacturing, how we're manufacturing, that we have business continuity plans in place, that we have disaster recovery, that we have a robust change management protocol and procedure, and that we're constantly doing continuous improvement. A big part of supply reliability and assurance is demand planning, and so the better forecasting we can get from end users, the better we can demand plan and make sure that we have built the needed capacity to supply our customers. So it's a lot of risk management and a lot of continuous analysis and continuous improvement to ensure success and supply security.
Perfect. Our next question, for configured products, do customers have control over changes to designs? Sara, is this for you?
Yes. Yep, so for configured products, it's no different than a customized design in that the customer owns that part number and they have complete control over that design and can change it at any point in time through our normal, engineering change request process. So it's no different than a custom design.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions we have time for, but thank you everyone for your questions. Before we finish the webinar, I would like to ask our presenters if they have any closing remarks. Lance, do you have any closing remarks?
Just as one thing that is kind of going hand in hand with Sara that we've implemented here with single use that's helped out is to really have a toolbox approach to your disposable assemblies so that your various different connections between bags can be accommodated with as few different assemblies as possible, and where possible to minimize the different materials of construction. We do use a couple of different films throughout the process. Ideally, it would be nice to have a film that is the same for all the bags, but that's not the current state that we're in. It's something that we can move towards in the future. But just that the implementation of single use, at least for the initial commercial launch, it seems to be the sweet spot. And then as you get into higher commercial productivity demands, to move into a more traditional plant.
Thank you. Sara, do you have any closing remarks? And then I think we have time to squeeze in one more question.
Sure. First, just want to say thank you for everyone's attendance and attention. And then secondly, just stress the keys to success are really a strong partnership with your supplier and robust risk management and making sure you're balancing, that supply security aspect, dual sourcing, flexibility. Those are all considerations that need to go into it to lead to a successful implementation.
Well, then, whilst we have the time, one last question. Is there any solution for high-potent drugs available, including secondary containment? Sara, would you like to answer this first? Or Lars?
Sure. So I can speak to it, and then maybe Lars. From a single-use perspective, most of the single-use films and components now have some data associated with high-potent drugs, things like ADCs, specifically for the conjugation steps within those processes. So yeah, most of the vendors now have data to support that and application studies to support that.
Thank you. Lance, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, and then we had designed an ADC facility within the BMS network, but considered that more of a drug product, where it did make use of single-use components where feasible, and then just had to dispose of those was, just making sure that you had the double containment, but using engineering controls to enable you to use the single-use components and then keep the ultra-potent compounds isolated until they're deactivated.
Thank you. I would like to take this opportunity then to thank our presenters once more. That's Lance Marquardt and Sara Bell for sharing their knowledge with us. So thank you. I would also like to remind our audience that they can view this and other webinars on demand by visiting biopharma-asia.com www.stephen.com/on-demand-webinars. And if you are watching this on demand, then please feel free to send your questions over to me at stephen.edwards@biopharma-asia.com. We'll try to get those answers back to you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.